This is a Fox News alert. The president's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, pleading guilty to lying to the FBI. Flynn now also cooperating with the investigation led by special counsel Robert Mueller. Hello, everyone. I'm Dana Perino, and this is the Daily Briefing. Prosecutors say Flynn's actions had a material impact on the FBI investigation into Russian contacts, adding, quote, Flynn falsely stated that he did not ask Moscow's ambassador to refrain from escalating the situation in response to U.S. sanctions on Russia. Flynn also falsely stated that he did not remember a follow-up conversation in which the ambassador stated that Russia chose to moderate its response to the sanctions as a result of Flynn's request. We have Team Fox coverage with John Roberts standing by at the White House. But we begin with Catherine Herridge live outside the federal courthouse in Washington. Catherine, you were in the courthouse before you came outside to give us this report. What did you see?
Well, thanks, Dana. Good afternoon. After 33 years of military service and 5 in combat, the retired general and former national security advisor entered the courthouse behind me, and he stood composed and stoic in the courtroom as he pled guilty to a felony, in this case, lying to federal investigators about his conversations with the Russian ambassador in December of 2016. What we really learned today was a lot of granular detail about how Flynn came to be like a go-between, carrying information between the Trump transition team and the Russian ambassador. And if we run through the timeline, you can see exactly what the government was getting to. About December 28th, this is when the Obama administration imposed sanctions on Russia in retaliating for interfering in the U.S. election. According to the newly unsealed court papers, on December 29th, Flynn called a senior official with the presidential transition team to discuss what he could say to the Russian ambassador about the issue. After that phone call, he engaged with the Russian ambassador, and after that, there were a series of conversations where the information was shared. On December 30th, the Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a statement saying their government would not escalate the matter, would not retaliate for the decision by the Obama administration to kick 35 diplomats out of the United States. And on or about December 31st, the Russian ambassador called Flynn and informed him that was their course of action. And if you remember to that period, Dana, the president said either publicly or on Twitter that Putin was a smart guy, in effect, that he had made the right decision in this case. But based on the records that were released today, we can see how much communication there was between the presidential transition team, Flynn, and the Russian ambassador. And the special counsel concluded that Flynn had deliberately misled them about those conversations and the nature of those conversations. And significantly, this was not a fact that was disputed by Flynn in court today as he entered that guilty plea, Dana.
Catherine, earlier on Harris's show, you were talking about how disciplined Michael Flynn has been, obviously, in a 33-year career in the military, showing that today in terms of his posture. I'm curious if you had any indication on a lack of discipline when it comes to actually talking to the FBI and now having to admit that he lied about it.
What I would say, having covered this now for the better part of a year, is that when you speak to people who are close to Flynn, they talk about this period leading up to Election Day and then in the transition period as almost overwhelmed with the amount of information that was coming at them, a very chaotic period, a period where they were not remembering events easily because they were so overwhelmed. And my colleague Brett Bure received some information earlier today from a source who has knowledge of FBI Director Comey's testimony to Congress earlier this year that his agents felt that Flynn hadn't deliberately misled them, but he was somehow mistaken in his conversation. So what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way is that in the spring of this year, Comey's agents felt Flynn had made a mistake. He was overwhelmed, he was confused, he couldn't remember the events. But when special counsel Robert Mueller came in and his team went through the information, perhaps additional evidence, they concluded something very different, that there was a deliberate effort to do so. But when you talk to people close to Flynn, I think one of the bottom lines today is that after a year of the financial strain and the emotional strain and looking at 3 more years of litigation, this ultimately broke him. And he felt the only option really for himself and his family was to make a deal. And that is sometimes the case once you get sort of in that sweet spot with a government investigation.
Catherine Herridge, thank you so much. Now let's head to Chief White House correspondent John Roberts. He's live on the North Lawn. John, what's the mood like over there today?
Well, Dana, we were expecting to hear from the president about 11:45 this morning when he was meeting with an official from Libya. However, at the last minute, they canceled the Oval Office pool spray. They said it was a scheduling mistake, that it never should have been on the schedule to begin with. I guess the president just didn't want to talk about what's going on today. The press will be going in, by the way, in the next few minutes for the White House Christmas party. It's being held in the afternoon this year as opposed to at night. That's an off-the-record event, though, so anything that's said during that event, unfortunately, we cannot bring to you. But we are hearing from White House Attorney Ty Cobb. He is the point person for the president on the Russia investigation, put out a statement a couple of hours ago in which he points out that Flynn was only the National Security Advisor for some 25 days and says, quote, the false statements involved mirror the false statements to White House officials, which resulted in his resignation in February this year. Nothing about the guilty plea or the charge implicates anyone other than Mr. Flynn. The conclusion of this phase of the special counsel's work demonstrates again that the special counsel is moving with all deliberate speed and clears the way for a prompt and reasonable conclusion. But muddying the waters in that statement, and what we understand so far, is what Catherine Herridge was talking about just a second ago. Here's some pictures from Palm Beach at Mar-a-Lago back on December 29, 2016. The president there with Don King. That's the day that Michael Flynn apparently talked to a senior transition official. We don't know who it was. There were a number of people who were down there. K.T. McFarland was his deputy at the time and spent a lot of time at Mar-a-Lago about Kislyak and what Russia should do in response to kicking out all of those diplomats and the sanctions that were levied against it. Vladimir Putin came out with a statement a day later to say that Russia was not going to respond in any type of escalation, to which President Trump tweeted, quote, great move on delay by Vladimir Putin. I always knew he was very smart. Now, we don't know if the information was passed along to the president about what the details of that phone call were, or if it never was, it just remained among the top transition officials. But on February the 16th, President Trump was asked directly if he asked Flynn to talk to Kislyak about sanctions, and he said no. Let's watch the exchange.
Did you direct Mike Flynn to discuss sanctions with the Russian ambassador?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't.
Inauguration.
No, I didn't. Mike, excuse me. No, I fired him because of what he said to Mike Pence. Very simple. Mike was doing his job. He was calling countries and his counterparts. So it certainly would have been okay with me if he did it. I would have directed him to do it if I thought he wasn't doing it. I didn't direct him, but I would have directed him because that's his job. No, I didn't direct him, but I would have directed him if he didn't do it, okay?
And a former senior intelligence official tells Brooks Singman, who's been doing some fine reporting for FoxNews.com, that early in the transition, President Trump instructed Michael Flynn to reach out to the Russians and a number of other governments as well, a number probably more than a dozen, just to establish some preliminary contacts. But what we don't know, Dana, is who told Flynn to contact the Russians about the sanctions, and really sort of the context, the broader context, and further detail about that succession of phone calls. But it's clear that someone who was in the president's immediate orbit knew what Flynn was doing, yet that information never made it to the vice president. Flynn says it was an oversight on his part to not tell Mike Pence, but it's getting curious in terms of that aspect of this.
All right, John Roberts, thank you so much. Let's bring in our legal panel. Bradley Moss is a national security attorney, and Robert Driscoll, we'll call him Bob, is a former deputy assistant attorney general under President George W. Bush. I wanted to ask you, maybe I could start with you, Bob. When Robert Mueller's team says that these lies had a material impact on the investigation, what does that mean? What is a material impact?
Well, partly they're just satisfying the legal standard that a false statement of the government to be prosecutable has to be a material false statement. So it can't be, I had a ham sandwich for lunch when you really had turkey. It has to mean something. And so what it has to mean is they're investigating something and the statement was false in a great enough way as to throw the investigation off or cause them to spend more time or send them in the wrong direction. And from the statements that were laid out in the information, it certainly seems that that's the case. They were looking into these conversations. He said they didn't happen or that certain topics didn't come up, and later admitted that they did. And they've got the admission now that he intentionally, misled the agents about that. So the materiality question is one that they're probably just satisfying the legal standard when they say that. That's unfortunately the way lawyers talk.
Well, we're glad that you're here to talk to us. Bradley, let me read to you a quote from Andy McCarthy. He's at the National Review, from a prosecutor. He says, "It remains unclear why the Obama Justice Department chose to investigate Flynn. There was nothing wrong with the incoming national security advisors having meetings with foreign counterparts or discussing such matters as the sanctions in those meetings. Plus, if the FBI and FISA had FISA recordings of Flynn's conversations with Kislyak, there was no need to ask Flynn what the conversations entailed." So, as President Trump was saying, it was his job to be talking to these governments, that he would have asked him to do it but he didn't actually give the direction. I guess that is now under dispute. But then why lie about it? Or was it just a mistake?
Well, and that becomes very much part of the question here that we don't know because there was only a plea deal. We know that the FBI was concerned about his exposure, Michael Flynn's exposure, due to not only false statements to the FBI about this call with Kislyak, but in terms of what had been listed on his security clearance paperwork, in terms of potential issues of whether or not he had failed to properly register as a foreign agent for lobbying purposes. So in terms of, to go to Andrew's question of why they would have been investigating him, because there was a concern about the extent to which someone who was slated to become the next national security advisor was exposed to foreign influence in a way that would put him at risk given the amount of classified information to which he'd be privy on a regular basis. And so that's both part of a criminal concern from something that they would investigate, but also something that would be just due diligence in the context of granting General Flynn the additional accesses to be the national security advisor. He would have had to have been vetted for that just like anybody else that would have a clearance, and this would have raised absolutely legitimate concerns.
Bob, this also reminded me of when Sally Yates, the Deputy Attorney General who was fired by President Trump, just days before that, she had gone to the White House and said, we want to make sure it's very clear to you, you could have some problems with Michael Flynn. Was that also a part of this?
Well, certainly it seems to be tangentially related in that the outgoing administration, I think, was obviously aware of this investigation, and particularly when it became public that Flynn was denying these contacts occurred, and I think the FBI or some counterintelligence agency was sitting on tapes of Flynn discussing these matters. That puts them in an awkward position, and so I think they probably made the decision to go to the existing White House and say, hey, this guy may have problems. You may not want to make him part of your inner circle. And it's, the prerogative of the president not to listen to that or to assume that's, politically motivated or something else. But it seems from this that that's likely what motivated the outgoing Justice Department to give the heads up to the incoming administration.
All right, Bradley and Bob, stick around because in a bit we're going to talk about a whole different angle to the Flynn story that I want to get your take on. But first, Texas Senator Ted Cruz joins us to react to all the news on a busy Friday after the break. Fox News alert: as the Senate nears a vote on the GOP tax bill, that news is overshadowed by a guilty plea from former White House National Security Advisor Michael Flynn in an agreement to cooperate with the Mueller investigation. For a reaction to both stories and more, we welcome Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Thanks for being with us today. Your legal mind is of interest to me right now. When the news broke today that there was a guilty plea coming from Michael Flynn, immediately partisans on both sides went out to explain why it's not a big deal or it's the biggest deal ever. From legally, would you just caution everybody to hold on a second because the investigation has a long way to go?
Well, no, I think that's exactly right. Today's news was disappointing and disturbing. General Flynn has many decades of honorable service defending this nation, and it is sad to see that he is now pleading guilty to criminal conduct. That gives all of us reason to pause. And I think from my perspective, all of us want to see what the underlying conduct was and what else may be implicated. There are multiple investigations that are ongoing. There are investigations in the Senate, in the House, and then, of course, the special counsel. So I think we should wait until we see all the facts and all the evidence before coming to a final judgment.
The reason we reached out to you last night was not because of Michael Flynn. It was about that shocking verdict out of San Francisco with a not guilty verdict in the murder of Kate Steinle. Your reaction to that, sir?
Well, the verdict was frustrating, and it makes you angry. Kate Steinle, a beautiful 32-year-old young woman, shot down in the prime of her life. She died in her father's arms, crying out, "Daddy, save me." As the father of two daughters, I can't imagine the agony. I've visited with Ms. Steinle's family, and I know they are grieving, and the verdict only makes the grief all the harder to deal with. What's most frustrating, Dana, is this crime never should have happened. And the best response to this verdict last night is that the Senate should take up and pass Kate's Law. Kate's Law is legislation I've introduced in the Senate that says if an illegal immigrant illegally enters the country a second time with an aggravated felony, that immigrant will face a mandatory minimum prison sentence. The person who shot Kate Steinle had been deported 5 times. He was an illegal immigrant, had been in and out of jail. If Kate's Law had been on the books, the person who pulled the trigger would have been in a federal prison cell instead of out there on that pier that night, and Kate Steinle would still be alive and with us today. The best thing Congress can do is pass Kate's Law right now and prevent the next tragic murder like the one we saw in California.
Do you think that the case was not well argued and presented by the prosecution, and would you support federal charges against him?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't examined the evidence that was presented at the trial and the specific arguments that the prosecutor made. As I understand it, the defense argued that the firing of the gun was accidental, and the jury heard those arguments. But none of that at the end of the day really matters, because if Kate's Law had been on the books, that defendant never would have been on the pier, never would have had that gun in the first place, because he would have been in jail, because he'd been deported 5 times. He was a repeat criminal. And when you allow illegal immigrants who are repeat criminals to be released, to be protected by sanctuary cities like San Francisco, the result is it's more dangerous for all of us.
Do you think that Senator McConnell would actually put that on the floor after you finish with tax reform, which looks like is going to be a successful one for the Republicans?
I hope so, and I'm certainly urging Mitch to take it up. We've taken it up and voted on it before, and the Democrats have filibustered Kate's Law. I hope they'll change their views, but you're right. Tax reform, we're getting ready to go vote on it in just a few minutes, and I'm very encouraged. It looks like we have the votes. I've been working night and day this year to really bring Republicans together to get to 50 votes, and I think we're on the verge of major historic tax cuts, lowering tax rates for small businesses, for farmers, for ranchers, for families. It's a big deal, and I'm very encouraged with where we are right now.
I imagine the mood's a little better today than it was when Obamacare repeal and replace didn't pass.
That's exactly right. And I'll tell you, Dana, one of the big deals in tax reform is part of this is repealing the individual mandate from Obamacare. That's something I argued for vociferously with a handful of other conservatives. We persuaded our colleagues, and it's in the bill. 6.5 million people every year the IRS fines under Obamacare because they can't afford health insurance. We're giving tax relief to all those people and ending that very unfair part of Obamacare.
Senator, I've loved having you on the show and would love to have you back. We're coming up on a hard break. Senator Ted Cruz, thanks so much. New developments in a legal case straining relations between the U.S. and a NATO ally. How a recent court case could shed some light on whether Turkish officials offered a bribe to Michael Flynn. Amid the fallout from Michael Flynn's guilty plea, more legal drama shedding light on possible work by Turkey to help companies evade U.S. sanctions on Iran. A controversial Turkish-Iranian gold trader telling a federal court that Turkish President Erdogan personally approved his sanction-breaking deals. Doug McElway is live in Washington with more. Doug, this story astounds me.
Yeah, it's just amazing and tremendously complex. We'll try to get through it here. Not many Americans are aware of this trial now ongoing in New York City, but people in Turkey, including its president Recep Erdogan, are riveted by it. It involves a Turkish gold trader named Reza Zarrab, who was accused of paying tens of millions of dollars in bribes to high Turkish government officials to help Iran circumvent U.S. sanctions. Well, moments before his trial was set to start, he flipped. pleaded guilty to all charges and is now testifying for U.S. prosecutors against another defendant. The scheme involved a complex money laundering operation that allowed Iran to skirt U.S. sanctions. But adding to the complexity of this, the wealthy Zarab, known for his yachts, cars, and extravagant life, hired a dream team of expensive lawyers, including Rudy Giuliani and former U.S. Attorney Michael Mukasey. Those two flew to Turkey to meet with President Erdogan to try to find a diplomatic solution to the Zarab's legal troubles. Another tangle in this web, Zarab was arrested under the direction of Trump adversary Preet Bharara when he was still U.S. Attorney in New York before he was fired by President Trump. And lastly, there is Michael Flynn. He was registered as a foreign agent for Turkey, and as the Zarab trial progresses, many people are curious to see if Zarab sings about whether Flynn may have tried to secure Zarab's freedom through the Erdogan government. Now, I know that's a lot to digest, Dana. Bottom line, keep your eye on the Zarab trial going on now in New York. It may throw a few surprises our way in the coming weeks.
Doug, you did a great job explaining all of that. I appreciate it. I'm now back with my legal panel, Bradley Moss and Bob Driscoll. So you were able to hear that. It caught my eye because this maybe there is nothing here to connect, but if you look at this whole NBC report that showed that there was a possible $15 million payout to come to Flynn and his son for kidnapping Gulen and getting him back to Erdogan. I mean, Bradley, what's going on here?
Oh, this is, again, bring it back to what we discussed in the prior segment. This is part of the concern that federal investigators had about Michael Flynn in particular, especially given that he was an unregistered foreign agent. He had not registered under the Foreign Agent Registration Act as an agent lobbying on behalf of Turkey or the Turkish government, and he was engaging in these efforts both during the transition in the campaign as well as when he first started in the White House to influence U.S. government policy in what appeared to be in support of his private client. That violates numerous different criminal provisions and is highly unethical and significantly raised concerns about the extent to which he was exposed and compromised from this type of connection. And it raises a separate issue, and this was also mentioned in those news reports, the question of whether or not there were bribes that had to have been part of Mr. Mueller's investigation of whether or not those bribes played any role in terms of anything Mr. Flynn did and how he communicated with the administration and influenced policy.
Bob, is that, with everything that Bradley just said, is that one of the reasons that some legal scholars this morning, looking at all of this, said Flynn, by pleading guilty to this lesser charge, probably got off easy because he could have been charged with higher crimes?
It certainly seems that way. I mean, if you compare the Flynn situation to Manafort, Manafort, the indictment, Special Counsel Mueller really brought the wood and charged everything, going back 10 years or so. And in this case, frankly, the information that was pled to is pretty light when compared to what's out there. And in particular, too, you got to remember, Flynn has very competent counsel. I mean, Kellner over at Covington and Burling is a top-flight lawyer. And so he wouldn't have entered into this plea unless he was kind of globally wrapping up all his exposure. And so it makes me wonder about all these prior reports we've heard about the kidnapping and the $15 million offer and things like that I think former CIA Director Woolsey had commented on. I wonder whether those reports were even accurate or if the government has dismissed them, because it seems odd to me if that were still hanging out there that would be looking at this plea today to one-count information.
Well, it is certainly another tangled web, I guess we could say, and we appreciate you, Bradley and Bob, being here today to help us figure it all out. We'll hope to have you back because obviously the story is not going away. Thanks so much.
Anytime.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, so the Senate taking up the GOP tax plan. We look live at the floor as we near a vote on the bill. Plus, new reaction from key lawmakers to the guilty plea by former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. A live report from Capitol Hill next. Fox News alert as we're following two big stories this afternoon. First, Michael Flynn pleads guilty to lying to the FBI about his contacts with the Russian ambassador. The former White House National Security Advisor agreeing to cooperate with the special counsel's investigation. While we are keeping a close eye on Capitol Hill as Senate Republicans get ready to vote on their tax bill. Mike Emanuel is standing by live on Capitol Hill. So where are we on tax reform? Is this happening today?
Dana, good afternoon. All indications are they have 50-plus votes in favor of tax reform, and they are hoping to get it done later today. The only wild card at this point is Tennessee Senator Bob Corker, who is pushing for so-called triggers to protect the taxpayers if the tax reform package does not live up to the expectations. The parliamentarian in the Senate said that wouldn't fit the rules, and so we await an announcement from Corker on how he will vote. Another undecided said a short time ago he's a yes.
Didn't get everything we wanted, but what I was pushing most for was on the expensing provision. There's a hard sunset in the bill that we all know is just a gimmick that we wouldn't honor. And so we were able to smooth that over a number of years and make it realistic.
The timing on the Senate floor seems to be the only uncertainty at this point, but bottom line, they expect to get it done perhaps late night tonight. Dana.
All right. And then what about the latest reaction there on Michael Flynn?
Well, it certainly sent a lot of shockwaves here on Capitol Hill. You had Tennessee Congressman Marsha Blackburn saying this is a lesson to officials here in Washington that most of the time it is the cover-up that gets folks in trouble. And so she said that's an important reminder for all in public life. A House Democrat said President Trump should have a measured response.
Obviously, the president has to decide how he's going to react. I'd strongly urge him not to interfere with this investigation in any way, shape, or form, and certainly not to fire Special Counsel Mueller. That would be the worst possible reaction that he could have.
Others say it is unfortunate, noting Lieutenant General Michael Flynn's many years of service to this country in uniform. Dana?
All right, to help us process all that, we now turn to Ben Shapiro, editor-in-chief at DailyWire.com, syndicated columnist and host of The Ben Shapiro Show, as well as Marianne Marsh, former senior advisor to Secretary of State John Kerry and principal at the Dewey Square Group. Ben, you're also a lawyer. When you first got the news this morning about this, what was your reaction?
And my initial reaction is that one of two things is happening. My initial reaction is that one of two things is happening with regard to Mike Flynn here. Possibility number one is that these charges were really reduced because Flynn has some really dirty stuff to say about other members of the Trump administration. The other possibility is that all they really had him on was this, or this is what they thought they could get in order for him to flip on senior level officials who were also presumably fibbing to the FBI. So you could end up in the first case with an actual charge of some sort of conspiracy with the Russian government. I think that's far-fetched. Or you could end up in the second case with a bunch of officials who are basically ensnared in an FBI investigation, saying that they lied to the FBI, but that there's not really any underlying crime. It looks a lot more like Scooter Libby than it does like Watergate. All right.
Marianne, there's the New York Times in May of 2017 said that Obama warned Trump about hiring Flynn, and he said Mr. Flynn's name came up during a broader discussion about personnel issues. The former administration official said Mr. Obama's concerns about Mr. Flynn, which were first reported by NBC News, were largely about his management of the DIA and predated the later concerns about his contacts with the Russian ambassador Sergei Kislyak. So it's no surprise that there was tension between Flynn and the Obama administration and some Democrats. But today, how do you look at it?
I think there's a lot more to it, Dana, than just his management style. Remember, the last two things Barack Obama discussed with Donald Trump before he left office and Donald Trump walked in, one was Michael Flynn, the other was North Korea. You wouldn't put those two topics together if they weren't really important. So I think this entire situation with Michael Flynn goes back to when he was at the DIA, when he left the DIA, what he did afterwards, what he did during the Trump campaign, and then when he walked into the White House as the National Security Advisor, who had access to the most important and sensitive information and secrets to this country. Michael Flynn only would agree to this deal, and it is one of the best deals you can get. Not that 5 years in jail and a $250,000 fine for lying to the FBI is nothing, but you only do that if you've got a lot of exposure on Russia and Turkey and many other things, and he clearly agreed to give up everybody and everything, including Donald Trump.
To get that. So Ty Cobb, the president's lawyer, Ben, tried to say, well, remember, everybody, he was Flynn was an Obama administration official. You think that's going to wash?
No, I don't think that's a good defense. I think that the best defense here is that we don't even know what Flynn was supposed to have done during the campaign, right? I mean, if you're Trump, what you're basically saying is, look, all that we know is that Flynn lied to the FBI about contacts that he had with Sergei Kislyak like 3 weeks before the administration actually took office during the transition. What does that have to do with collusion? What does that have to do with conspiracy? What does that have to do with some sort of sneaky deal with Russia? It's not even illegal. I mean, he was at that point about to become a transition official. So what exactly went wrong here? If you're the Trump team, what you're saying is that if the best you can do is lie to the FBI about a series of phone calls that were not illegal and were not even really politically problematic, then this is a witch hunt. That seems to me their best defense here.
Okay, but Marianne, I guess my question is why, unless it was a mistake and you just forgot, why lie about that in the first place if there's nothing wrong with contacting officials when you're in the transition?
Exactly, because you have something more to hide. I mean, almost everybody so far has lied about something having to do with Russia. Put a name on the table that's associated with Donald Trump, and they've lied about their contacts with Russia. So you have to ask why. If they're willing to either lie to the FBI or commit perjury, as we've seen others do in front of congressional committees, they're hiding something big. And last point, you used the clip earlier in the show from February 16th when Donald Trump was at a press availability denying that he instructed Michael Flynn to make those calls to Kislyak. So this comes down to whether Donald Trump isn't telling the truth, or did he tell Jared Kushner or someone else to make that call for him? Donald Trump has been intimately involved in all of this every step of the way, including dictating the statement about his son that it was really a meeting about adoption with the Russian operatives in Trump Tower, not about sanctions.
Well, there's plenty more of this to come. I've just been trying to caution everybody. This is one step in what is probably a pretty long investigation. So hopefully everyone can go and have a good weekend and not worry about it until we call you back next week to give us more information. Ben Shapiro and Marianne Marsh, thank you so much. The Dow taking a steep dive after Michael Flynn's guilty plea. Earlier today, the Dow fell 350 points after the news broke before recovering most of those losses. Let's bring in Nicole Petalides at the New York Stock Exchange. I imagine, Nicole, that shock wears off pretty quickly and people get more excited that they think that this tax bill is really going to pass.
Yeah, that's the whole idea of it. The markets have to digest one headline after another. In fact, Dana, we had our biggest point swing top to bottom, 400 points in such a short time since Brexit, since June of last year. Right before all this news broke out, we were up about 50 points. That was just before 11 a.m. Then we have this breaking news, and the traders were the first to say they were concerned about all the news on Flynn, that it wasn't about the tax bill, worries about the tax bill, and what he may or may not say about the president. The market tanks 350 points. At that point, I have to tell you, I talked to different traders. Some were saying, I'm buying the dips up on the day. I mean, it sounds insane, but they felt it was a little bit of he said, she said, and now you can see that we've recovered much of those losses. We're down about 80 points right now. I will leave you with a few ideas, and that is that first, we're still having a winning week. The Dow is seeing the best week of 2017, despite all these volatile headlines and a little bit of a white knuckle roller coaster ride today. And there are some cautionary tones going into the weekend. We're going to have a lot of the news shows that are going to be a lot of developments. But as you noted, Dana, this is long-term investigations, and the traders are focusing on tax relief and earnings and fundamentals, a better economy, better jobs, consumer confidence, and they're keeping it on long term. They're still keeping an eye on up arrows. Back to you.
Well, of course, it's good weather too, so people will be out and about shopping for their holiday presents.
Right,
Nicole Petalides, thanks so much. We'll have much more on today's bombshell from Washington. So what comes next in the Mueller investigation? New insights from the Wall Street Journal coming up next.